serial killers from every state in the USA. Here's a question to keep you up at night. What do all 50 states have in common? No, it's not apple pie or football. It's something much darker: serial killers. From Alaska's icy wilderness to Florida's sweaty swamps, America has more than its fair share of horrifying tales. And today, we're taking a coast-to-coast road trip to meet the most infamous and bizarre murderers who called each state home. But don't worry, this isn't going to be all doom and gloom. There's plenty of weird, even laughable trivia about some of these creeps. Trust me, you'll never look at pickles or roller coasters the same way again. Buckle up, it's time for a killer ride. 1. Alabama, the Giggling Granny. Let's kick off in Alabama with Nanny Doss, better known as the Giggling Granny. Between the 1920s and 1950s, this sweet-looking grandma didn't bake cookies. She baked arsenic into food for her victims. Nanny took family drama to a whole new level by poisoning 11 relatives, including her husbands, children, and even her mother. Why? She claimed she was looking for the perfect romantic partner, but really, it was about insurance payouts. Oh, and her signature move? She'd giggle during her confessions. Picture a cartoon granny rocking in her chair and cackling about how she slipped a little arsenic into her husband's coffee. Caught after husband number 5 keeled over, she spent the rest of her life in prison. Moral of the story? If Granny's giggling, don't eat the stew. 2. Alaska, the Butcher Baker. Heading north, we meet Robert Hansen, the Butcher Baker. Imagine this: a soft-spoken baker in Anchorage who also ran a side hustle, kidnapping women, flying them into the Alaskan wilderness, and hunting them for sport. Yes, you heard me right. In the 1970s and 80s, Hansen's game involved at least 17 women. He even kept a creepy treasure map marking the graves of his victims, which ultimately led to his capture in 1983. But here's a bizarre twist. Hansen loved to bake. Locals raved about his cinnamon rolls, completely unaware that their friendly baker was also a sadistic killer. So, next time you visit a mom-and-pop bakery in Alaska, maybe skip the pastries and just stick to coffee. 3. Arizona, the Serial Shooter. In sunny Arizona, we find Dale Hausner and Samuel Diedemann, the serial shooters. Between 2005 and 2006, this duo terrorized Phoenix by randomly shooting pedestrians, pets, and even bicyclists. The weird part? They claimed it was all for fun, like some kind of twisted real-life video game. Hausner, the brains of the operation, even worked as a crime photographer. Talk about keeping it close to home. Diedemann, his accomplice, seemed to enjoy the mayhem just as much. Caught after a lengthy investigation, they were convicted of multiple murders and sent to death row. Arizona may be hot, but these two brought a whole new meaning to the term firepower. 4. Arkansas, the Phantom Killer. Arkansas takes us back to the 1940s with the chilling case of the Phantom Killer, who inspired the movie that had a dreaded sundown. This masked murderer attacked couples parked in lovers' lanes, killing 5 and injuring others. The eerie part? The Phantom was never caught. People in Texarkana slept with shotguns by their beds for months, and to this day, the case remains unsolved. Maybe he got away, or maybe he just hung up the mask. Either way, it's a classic cautionary tale. If you're on a date in Arkansas, maybe stick to dinner and a movie. 5. California, the Zodiac Killer. And now, the Golden State gives us the notorious Zodiac Killer. Active in the late 60s, this guy sent taunting letters and cryptic ciphers to newspapers, claiming responsibility for at least 5 murders. But here's the kicker: he was never caught. The Zodiac had a flair for the dramatic, leaving behind a legacy of unsolved puzzles and frustrated detectives. Some say he worked alone. Others think it was a group effort. Oh, and one of his ciphers was finally cracked. Absolutely nothing useful. If you're into escape rooms, the Zodiac's puzzles might be your ultimate challenge. 6. Colorado. Ted Bundy's Escape Act. Ah, Colorado. Known for its stunning Rocky Mountains and Ted Bundy's infamous jailbreak. While Bundy was active across multiple states, Colorado holds the distinction of being the state where he slipped right through the fingers of the law twice. In 1977, Bundy was facing trial for the murder of Karen Campbell, a crime as gruesome as it was calculated. During a court recess, Bundy, ever the opportunist, jumped out of a second-story window of the courthouse library. He roamed free for 6 days before being caught. But wait, it gets better. 6 months later, while awaiting trial in a different facility, Bundy starved himself to squeeze through a tiny hole in the ceiling of his cell and escape again. This time, he went on to Florida, where his killing spree would finally come to an end. Colorado may have lost him, but the Sunshine State eventually brought him to justice. Moral of the story? Don't underestimate a guy with a law degree and a knack for gymnastics. 7. Connecticut, the woodchipper murder. In Connecticut, we find Richard Crafts in one of the most chillingly bizarre cases. In 1986, Crafts murdered his wife Hella and attempted to dispose of her body using, you guessed it, a woodchipper. Here's the kicker. Crafts was so meticulous that authorities almost didn't catch him. It took tiny fragments of bone, teeth, and even a fingernail found near the banks of the Housatonic River to piece the puzzle together. And get this, he was convicted, largely because of a snowplow driver's testimony, who saw Crafts using the chipper on a snowy night. Talk about leaving a paper trail, or, in this case, a bone trail. 8. Delaware. Stephen Brian Pennell, the Corridor Killer. Delaware may be small, but its dark history looms large with Stephen Brian Pennell, a.k.a. the Corridor Killer. Active in the late 1980s, Pennell preyed on women along Route 40, torturing and killing at least 3 victims, though authorities suspect there were more. Here's a bizarre twist. Pennell was caught after a victim's hair and fibers from his van linked him to the crime. But what stands out most? His day job. This cold-blooded killer was an electrician, spending his days wiring homes and his nights committing heinous acts. It's unsettling to think the guy installing your light fixtures might have had far darker hobbies. 9. Florida. Aileen Wuornos. Florida, the state of sunshine, alligators, and Aileen Wuornos, perhaps one of the most infamous female serial killers in history. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos murdered 7 men, claiming they had assaulted her while she was working as a prostitute. Her method? A simple handgun? And her motive? Well, that depends on who you ask. Wuornos maintained it was self-defense, but the evidence painted a more complicated picture. The dramatic irony? Despite her hardened demeanor, Wuornos was known to be deeply emotional, even breaking down during her trial. Wuornos was convicted and sentenced to death, and she famously said her final words before her execution in 2002. "I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus." Florida does love its fireworks, but I think we'll pass on this encore, Aileen. 10. Georgia, the Atlanta child murders. Georgia's darkest chapter is the Atlanta child murders, a series of at least 28 killings of young black children, teens, and adults between 1979 and 1981. The suspect, Wayne Williams, was linked to 2 of the murders, but never formally convicted for the majority of the victims. Here's the unsettling part. Most of the evidence against Williams was circumstantial, like carpet fibers from his home and car. Yet, he was convicted in 1982 and sentenced to life in prison. To this day, many argue whether Williams was responsible for all the murders or if others were involved. What's clear, though, is how these cases exposed systemic neglect toward Atlanta's black community at the time. 11. Hawaii, the Honolulu Strangler. Next stop, Paradise, or at least it would be, if not for the Honolulu Strangler. Between 1985 and 1986, this unidentified killer claimed the lives of 5 women, dumping their bodies in secluded areas around Oahu. The Honolulu Strangler was Hawaii's first known serial killer, and despite a massive investigation, the case remains unsolved. The creepy part? All the victims were strangled with their own clothing. To this day, the Honolulu Strangler haunts local folklore as a ghostly figure who might still be out there waiting. 12. Idaho. Lyda Southard, the Black Widow of the West. Idaho brings us Lyda Southard, America's original Black Widow. In the early 20th century, Lyda charmed her way through 5 husbands, all of whom mysteriously died under similar circumstances. Her secret weapon? Arsenic, cleverly disguised in homemade pies. Detectives finally caught on when they noticed that all her husbands shared one thing in common: life insurance policies with Lyda as the beneficiary. When she was arrested, she famously told reporters, "I just have bad luck with men." Yeah, Lyda, that's one way to put it. She was convicted of 1 murder in 1921 and spent decades in prison before being paroled. It's safe to say she didn't remarry after that. 13. Illinois. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. In Illinois, we meet John Wayne Gacy, the infamous killer clown. Gacy seemed like an average guy. He ran a successful construction business, hosted neighborhood parties, and even dressed up as Pogo the Clown for kids' events. But behind the grease paint and balloon animals was a man responsible for the murders of at least 33 young men and boys in the 1970s. Here's where it gets even creepier. Gacy buried most of his victims in the crawl space beneath his home, which neighbors complained often reeked of a strange smell. The dramatic irony? He once told police, "You can't prove a clown did it." Spoiler alert, they could. Gacy's arrest came in 1978 after a trail of missing persons led straight to his doorstep. Sentenced to death, Gacy spent his final years painting, you guessed it, clown portraits before his execution in 1994. Next time you see a clown, maybe think twice about hiring them for your party. 14. Indiana. Herb Baumeister, the I-70 Strangler. In the Hoosier State, we meet Herb Baumeister, a seemingly normal family man who owned a chain of thrift stores. But Herb had a dark secret. He was the I-70 Strangler, responsible for at least 11 murders in the 1990s. Herb would lure young men to his sprawling Fox Hollow farm under the guise of a party, only for the party to end in murder. The bodies? Scattered across his property. Here's a weird twist. Herb's family didn't know a thing. His wife claimed she never ventured into certain parts of their house, including the pool area where the murders took place. When police finally closed in, Herb fled to Canada and took his own life, leaving behind more questions than answers. As for his farm, it's rumored to be haunted, because of course it is. 15. Iowa. Carol Edward Cole. Iowa gave us Carol Edward Cole, a serial killer who claimed at least 15 victims from the 1940s to the 1980s. Cole had a peculiar excuse for his crimes. He blamed his mother. Cole believed his mom's emotional abuse and infidelity triggered his hatred for women, leading him to target prostitutes and women he considered unfaithful. He often strangled his victims, believing he was saving society. But here's the bizarre part. Cole kept a meticulous journal detailing his murders, which ultimately became evidence against him. His trial revealed a mix of cold calculation and a warped sense of justice. Cole left behind a legacy as one of the Midwest's most chilling killers. Talk about holding a grudge. 16. Kansas. Dennis Rader, BTK. Kansas is home to Dennis Rader, better known as BTK, for bind, torture, kill. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader murdered 10 people while maintaining the facade of a picture-perfect suburban life. The dramatic irony? Rader was a church leader, a Boy Scout volunteer, and even a compliance officer who took pride in enforcing city codes. He once ticketed a neighbor for having an overgrown lawn while hiding his own dark secrets. Rader's downfall came in 2005 when his craving for attention led him to send taunting letters to police, including a floppy disk that contained metadata linking back to his church. Caught red-handed, Rader is now serving 10 life sentences in a Kansas prison. Moral of the story? Maybe don't write "catch me if you can" to law enforcement. 17. Kentucky. Donald Harvey, the Angel of Death. Kentucky brings us Donald Harvey, a hospital worker who earned the chilling nickname, the Angel of Death. Active in the 1970s and 80s, Harvey claimed to have killed over 80 patients, though authorities confirmed around 37. What makes Harvey's case so unsettling is the setting. He worked in hospitals, where patients trusted him with their lives. His methods included poisoning with cyanide, arsenic, and even injecting patients with contaminated fluids. Here's a bizarre twist. Harvey claimed he was putting people out of their misery, though many of his victims weren't terminally ill. Caught after an autopsy revealed high levels of cyanide in one of his victims, Harvey was sentenced to multiple life terms. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, not hunting grounds. 18. Louisiana. Ronald Dominique, the Bayou Strangler. In Louisiana, we have Ronald Dominique, the Bayou Strangler, who murdered at least 23 men between 1997 and 2006. Dominique lured his victims by offering them money or a place to stay, only to assault and strangle them. Despite the brutality of his crimes, Dominique blended into his community as a quiet, unassuming man. The irony: he was so ordinary that even his neighbors described him as harmless. Dominique's arrest came after a tip from one of his would-be victims, who narrowly escaped. He confessed in chilling detail, claiming he didn't want to hurt anyone, but felt compelled. Sentenced to 8 life terms, Dominique will spend the rest of his days in a Louisiana prison. Sometimes it's the quiet ones you've got to watch. 19. Maine, James Hicks. Up in Maine, we meet James Hicks, a man who hid his crimes in plain sight for over 20 years. Between 1977 and 1996, Hicks murdered at least 3 women and managed to evade capture thanks to his ability to blend into small-town life. Hicks was finally caught in 2000 when he confessed to a friend, who then tipped off the police. But here's the kicker. Hicks helped investigators locate the remains of his victims, all while calmly discussing his crimes. The juxtaposition of his nonchalant demeanor with the horrors he committed left everyone stunned. Hicks is now serving life without parole, proving that even sleepy Maine has its share of nightmares. 20. Maryland, Joseph Matheny. And finally, Maryland gives us Joseph Matheny, a man whose crimes were as horrific as they were absurd. Matheny, known as the Cannibal, claimed to have murdered 10 people in the 1990s. But that's not the worst part. Matheny alleged that he used the remains of his victims to make hamburgers, which he then sold at his roadside BBQ stand. It tasted just like regular pork, he reportedly said. The irony? Matheny was caught not because of his BBQ stand, but because he got careless and left evidence at one of his crime scenes. Convicted of 2 murders, Matheny died in prison in 2017. If this story doesn't make you rethink roadside BBQ, I don't know what will. 21. Massachusetts. The Boston Strangler. In Massachusetts, we encounter Albert DeSalvo, better known as the Boston Strangler. Between 1962 and 1964, DeSalvo claimed responsibility for the murders of 13 women, many of whom were strangled with their own stockings. Here's the creepy part. DeSalvo gained entry to his victims' homes by pretending to be a maintenance worker or a salesman. Once inside, he turned charm into terror. What makes this case even more bizarre? DeSalvo was never formally convicted of the murders. He was arrested for unrelated crimes and confessed while in prison, but his confession has been disputed for decades. In 2013, DNA evidence linked him to one of the murders, but questions remain. Is he the only Boston Strangler, or was someone else lurking in those shadows? Either way, it's a chilling reminder that not everyone who knocks on your door is who they seem. 22. Michigan. Elias Abuela Zam, the serial stabber. Michigan's dark chapter comes with Elias Abuela Zam. Between May and August 2010, Abuela Zam attacked 20 men across Flint, Michigan, and nearby states, killing 5. His method was simple and terrifying. He would approach his victims, often offering help or asking for directions, then suddenly stab them. The victims were mostly African American, sparking concerns about racial motivations, though Abuela Zam never confirmed this. The absurd irony? He was caught at an airport while trying to flee the country because he left a bag with bloody knives in his car. Convicted of multiple murders, Abuela Zam is serving life in prison. Talk about a case where being helpful went horribly wrong. 23. Minnesota. Paul Michael Stephanie, the weepy-voiced killer. Minnesota introduces us to Paul Michael Stephanie, the weepy-voiced killer. Active in the 1980s, Stephanie committed multiple murders and assaults, but what sets him apart is his bizarre habit of calling the police to confess while crying hysterically. In one call, he sobbed, "God, forgive me. I don't know why I did it." But don't let the theatrics fool you. Stephanie was ruthless, attacking women with hammers and other weapons. His downfall came when one of his victims survived and identified him. Stephanie's dramatic irony lies in his guilt-ridden calls, which ultimately became key evidence against him. Convicted in 1983, he spent his final years in prison before dying of cancer. Let's just say he was crying all the way to his cell. Mississippi, the Natchez Burning. In Mississippi, we delve into the mysterious Natchez Burning, a series of unsolved murders from the 1960s involving civil rights activists. While not the work of a single serial killer, this case is tied to a reign of terror by the Ku Klux Klan, who targeted African Americans and their allies. One infamous case involved Ben Chester White, an elderly farmer who was lured into the woods and murdered to send a message to civil rights leaders. The killers were identified, but never brought to justice. A haunting reminder of systemic failures in that era. Though not your typical serial killer story, the Natchez Burning cases reveal the dark underbelly of Mississippi's history, where fear and hatred claimed far too many lives. 25. Missouri. Robert Berdella, the Kansas City Butcher. Next stop, Missouri, home to Robert Berdella, the Kansas City Butcher. In the 1980s, Berdella lured young men to his home under the guise of helping them, only to subject them to weeks of torture before killing them. Here's the horrifying twist. Berdella kept detailed journals of his crimes, describing each act with chilling precision. He even took Polaroid photos, documenting the suffering of his victims. Berdella was caught in 1988 when a victim escaped, naked, and with a dog collar around his neck. Arrested shortly after, Berdella confessed to 6 murders and was sentenced to life in prison. He died of a heart attack in 1992, leaving behind a legacy as one of Missouri's most sadistic killers. 26. Montana. Wayne Nance, the Missoula Mauler. Montana's contribution to this grim list is Wayne Nance, the Missoula Mauler. Active in the 1970s and 80s, Nance worked as a furniture delivery man by day and a predator by night. Nance is believed to have murdered at least 6 people, though his true victim count remains unknown. The bizarre twist: he was never formally charged because he was killed in 1986 during an attempted murder. His intended victim Doug Wells, managed to overpower and shoot him in self-defense. Nance's death left many questions unanswered, but one thing's clear. Montana's wide-open spaces can't hide dark secrets forever. 27. Nebraska. John Joubert, the Woodfield Slayer. In Nebraska, we find John Joubert, the Woodfield Slayer. Active in the early 1980s, Joubert targeted young boys, killing at least 3. His method was particularly gruesome. He used a knife to stab his victims and often left bite marks on their bodies. The absurd twist? Joubert was caught because of a piece of rope he used to bind one of his victims. Investigators traced it to a specific military supply store, leading them straight to him. Convicted of multiple murders, Bertha was executed in 1996. His case remains one of Nebraska's most chilling examples of predatory violence. 28. Nevada. Stephen Morin, the Chameleon Killer. Nevada's entry is Stephen Morin, the Chameleon Killer, who earned his nickname for his ability to assume multiple identities. Active in the 1970s and 80s, Morin crisscrossed the country, killing at least 30 women. Morin's downfall came in 1981 when he kidnapped a woman in Las Vegas, only to be caught after a high-speed chase. The irony? He was carrying a Bible at the time of his arrest, claiming he had found God. Sentenced to death, Morin's case highlights the dangers of a man who could be anyone, anywhere, at any time. If you met a charming stranger in Nevada back then, you might have been playing a deadly game of roulette. 29. New Hampshire. Sheila LaBar, the Vigilante Killer. Welcome to New Hampshire, where Sheila LaBar made her twisted mark as a self-proclaimed avenger. Living on a secluded farm, Sheila lured vulnerable men, claiming she was on a mission to cleanse the earth of predators. But here's where it gets bizarre. She would force her victims to confess to imagined crimes on tape before killing them. Sheila even dyed her hair fiery red, saying it symbolized her righteous rage. Dramatic much? Her farm became a literal horror show when investigators found bones, teeth, and charred remains scattered around the property. Caught in 2006, Sheila was sentenced to life in prison. The ironic part? Her delusion of justice only highlighted her own monstrous hypocrisy. If a farm ever screams haunted, this is the one. 30. New Jersey. Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman. New Jersey is home to Richard Kuklinski, a.k.a. the Iceman. And no, it's not because he loved popsicles. Kuklinski earned his nickname because he froze his victims to confuse the time of death. Genius, right? In a terrifying, sociopathic way. Operating as a hitman for the mob, Kuklinski claimed to have killed over 200 people from the 1950s to the 1980s. His methods? Let's just say he was creative. Cyanide, crossbows, and even a hand grenade made the list. Here's the ironic twist. Kuklinski had a loving family who had no idea about his double life. His daughter once described him as strict but kind, proving that appearances can be deadly deceiving. Caught in 1986 after an undercover sting, Kuklinski spent the rest of his life in prison. Imagine being at a family BBQ, knowing Dad's favorite dish might just be cyanide meatballs. 31. New Mexico. David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer. Things get especially dark in New Mexico with David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer. Ray had a soundproof trailer, his toy box, filled with torture devices and disturbing items. Think of it as a haunted house, minus the fun and candy. From the mid-1980s to 1999, Ray is believed to have tortured and killed multiple women, though his exact victim count remains a mystery. The chilling part? He recorded audio tapes for his victims, describing the horrors he planned to inflict. But here's the kicker. Ray was caught not because of a police investigation, but because one of his victims escaped, running naked to a neighbor's house, wearing only a dog collar. Dramatic irony at its peak. The man who controlled everything couldn't foresee his own undoing. Ray died in prison in 2002, but his case left scars on the quiet desert town of Elephant Butte. 32. New York. Joel Rifkin, the suburban strangler. Heading to New York, we find Joel Rifkin, a man whose ineptitude was as infamous as his crimes. Between 1989 and 1993, Rifkin killed 17 women, dumping their bodies in remote areas across the state. Here's the absurd twist. Rifkin was caught not because of a high-stakes police chase or a brilliant sting operation, but because of an expired license plate. Police pulled him over for it and found a body in the trunk. Talk about bad timing. During his trial, Rifkin's defense team argued he was deeply troubled and socially awkward. No kidding, his neighbors described him as the weird guy who always kept to himself. Rifkin was sentenced to 203 years in prison, where he'll have plenty of time to reflect on the importance of vehicle registration. 33. North Carolina. Henry Louis Wallace, the Taco Bell Strangler, aka the Taco Bell Strangler. Between 1992 and 1994, Wallace murdered 10 women, many of whom worked at fast food restaurants he frequented. Here's where it gets ironic. Wallace was so polite and friendly that even his victims initially trusted him. One co-worker described him as the guy who never forgot to say thank you, which makes his crimes all the more unsettling. Wallace's reign of terror ended in 1994 when he confessed to the murders in chilling detail. Sentenced to death, Wallace now spends his days on death row. And the next time you're at Taco Bell, maybe keep an eye on the guy being overly nice about his nachos. 34. North Dakota. Eugene Butler, the Midnight Murderer. North Dakota may be small, but its macabre history is big thanks to Eugene Butler, a recluse from the early 1900s. Known as the Midnight Murderer, Butler's crimes weren't discovered until long after his death in 1913. In 1921, workers demolishing his home found 6 skeletons buried in the basement. The victims? Likely farmhands who worked for Butler and mysteriously disappeared. The dramatic irony? Butler was known for his paranoia. Sure, nobody so suspected he was hiding bodies under his floorboards. While the full story remains shrouded in mystery, Butler's case stands as a grim reminder that even the quietest towns have skeletons in their closets. Literally. 35. Ohio. Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler. In Ohio, we meet Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, whose crimes shocked the nation in the late 2000s. Sowell lured women to his home with promises of alcohol or drugs, only to assault and murder them. The horrifying twist? Sowell lived in a densely populated neighborhood, and neighbors frequently complained about a foul odor emanating from his house. His excuse? He blamed a nearby sausage factory. Sowell's crimes were uncovered in 2009 when police searched his home and found 11 bodies. The dramatic irony here? For years, his crimes were hidden in plain sight, masked by the chaos of urban life. Sentenced to death, Sowell died in prison in 2021, leaving behind a community grappling with unanswered questions. 36. Oklahoma. Roger Dale Stafford, the Hi-Fi Killer. Next up, Oklahoma, a state with its own brand of terror. Roger Dale Stafford, also known as the Hi-Fi Killer, didn't bother with subtlety. In 1978, Stafford and his accomplices went on a spree that left 9 people dead in 2 separate massacres. But here's where it gets absurd. Stafford's downfall wasn't due to high-tech forensics or police work. Nope. His wife turned him in after he cheated on her. That's right. After all the chaos he caused, it was marital drama that sealed his fate. Convicted and sentenced to death, Stafford was executed in 1995. The lesson here? If you're going to commit atrocities, maybe don't make enemies with the one person who knows all your secrets. Not that we're giving tips or anything. 37. Oregon, Randall Woodfield, the I-5 killer. Oregon brings us Randall Woodfield, a man who went from catching footballs to catching prison sentences. A former NFL draft pick for the Green Bay Packers, Woodfield traded touchdowns for terror as the I-5 killer, murdering and assaulting victims along the West Coast in the early 1980s. Here's where it gets oddly specific. He had an obsession with phone booths. Woodfield would often call his victims from a payphone to lure them out. Imagine being stalked by a guy who's loitering around a phone booth like it's 1982. Oh, wait. It was caught thanks to DNA evidence. Woodfield is now serving life in Oregon. The Packers may have dodged a bullet by cutting him early, but it's safe to say he didn't let rejection go quietly. 38. Pennsylvania. Gary Heidnik, the House of Horrors. In Pennsylvania, we meet Gary Heidnik, a man whose crimes sound like something out of a twisted horror movie. In the late 1980s, Heidnik lured women to his Philadelphia home, where he held them captive in a pit in his basement. But here's the chilling irony. Heidnik wasn't some unkempt recluse. He was a wealthy investor with a fondness for flashy cars and fancy dinners. His neighbors thought he was eccentric but harmless. Spoiler alert, he was far from harmless. Heidnik's reign ended in 1987 when one of his captives escaped and led police to the House of Horrors. Convicted of 2 murders and countless other atrocities, Heidnik was executed in 1999. Let this be a reminder. Just because someone looks like they're good with money doesn't mean they're good with people. 39. Rhode Island. Craig Price, the Warwick slasher. Rhode Island may be the smallest state, but Craig Price proves it can still deliver big nightmares. At just 13 years old, Price began a killing spree that would claim 4 lives by the time he was 15. The most chilling part? Price wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in alleys. He was the kid next door. Known for his charm and quick wit, no one suspected he was capable of such brutality. Caught in 1989, Price confessed to the murders in shocking detail. But here's the kicker. Due to Rhode Island's juvenile laws at the time, Price couldn't be held beyond his 21st birthday. Lawmakers scrambled to close the loophole, but not before. Price's case became a cautionary tale about underestimating the boy next door. 40. South Carolina. Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, the meanest man in America. Down in South Carolina, we meet Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, a man whose nickname is as misleading as they come. Gaskins, active from the 1950s to the 1970s, was anything but small time. He claimed to have killed over 100 people. Here's where it gets absurd. Gaskins believed he had a private graveyard, where he buried victims who annoyed him. Yep, that's right. His murders were sometimes motivated by sheer irritation. Talk about taking petty to a whole new level. Gaskins was eventually caught and sentenced to death, but not before he earned the title, the meanest man in America. And honestly, he deserved it. If you ever feel like you're dealing with someone unreasonable, just remember you're not dealing with Pee Wee. 41. South Dakota. Robert Leroy Anderson, the duct tape killer. South Dakota brings us Robert Leroy Anderson, the duct tape killer. Anderson was a seemingly mild-mannered family man who worked at a meatpacking plant. But behind closed doors, he used his job as a cover for his twisted crimes. In the 1990s, Anderson kidnapped and murdered multiple women, using duct tape as his weapon of choice to bind and silence his victims. The irony? Anderson's downfall came when he got too cocky, leaving evidence that led straight back to him. Sentenced to death, Anderson died in prison before his execution. If duct tape is known for fixing everything, Anderson used it to break lives. Not exactly the endorsement 3M was hoping for. 42. Tennessee. Paul Dennis Reed, the fast food killer. Tennessee introduces us to Paul Dennis Reed, the fast food killer, whose reign of terror in the late 1990s targeted employees of fast food restaurants. Reed's motive? Robbery. His method? Brutality. Reed would rob these establishments, then execute the employees to eliminate witnesses. The absurd irony? Despite being a failed country singer, Reed insisted he had the charisma to be famous. Well, he got his fame, just not the kind he wanted. Captured in 1997, Reed was sentenced to death for 7 murders. And while he may not have made it to the Grand Ole Opry, his crimes left a lasting mark on Tennessee's history. 43. Texas. Dean Corll, the Candy Man. In Texas, we meet Dean Corll, the Candy Man, a nickname that sounds sweet but hides a horrifying truth. Corll, along with 2 teenage accomplices, lured at least 28 young boys to their deaths in the 1970s. The disturbing twist? Corll worked at his family's candy factory and used free candy to befriend his victims. Picture Willy Wonka with a torture chamber, and you've got Dean Corll. His crimes came to light when one of his accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley, turned on him and shot him in self-defense. The irony? Corll's empire of terror crumbled because of the very people he manipulated. Turns out you really can't trust the guy handing out free candy. 44. Utah. Mark Hoffman, the murderous forger. Utah brings us Mark Hoffman, a guy who turned forgery into an extreme sport. In the 1980s, Hoffman made a living selling fake historical documents, including some that rewrote the history of the Mormon Church. Here's the twist. When people started catching on to his schemes, Hoffman decided the best way to cover his tracks was murder. He built homemade bombs and sent them to his critics, killing 2 people. Yep, this guy was so committed to lying that he literally exploded under pressure. Pun intended. Caught when one of his bombs accidentally went off in his car. Karma is real, folks. Hoffman was sentenced to life in prison. He now spends his days behind bars, probably thinking about all the forgery potential in monopoly money. 45. Vermont. Gerald Montgomery, the barrel stasher. Vermont, known for maple syrup, scenic mountains, and Gerald Montgomery, the guy who thought barrels were a great hiding place for murder victims. In the 1980s, Montgomery killed at least 3 people and stuffed their bodies into barrels, which he conveniently left in the woods. The irony? He labeled one barrel "Do Not Open" because nothing screams totally normal barrel like a handwritten warning. Spoiler alert, someone opened it. When police caught him, Montgomery claimed he just didn't know what else to do with the bodies. How about not killing people, Gerald? Sentenced to life, he now has plenty of time to think about better storage solutions. 46. Virginia. Timothy Spencer, the South Side Strangler. In Virginia, Timothy Spencer earned the title of the South Side Strangler in the 1980s. Spencer was the first criminal in the U.S. to be convicted using DNA evidence, making him infamous in crime history. Here's the kicker. Spencer would break into homes and target women who lived alone. But what's truly absurd? He had a day job as a furniture mover. Imagine hiring someone to help rearrange your living room, not knowing he's rearranging crime statistics at night. Convicted and sentenced to death, Spencer's case marked a turning point for forensic science. So, in a weird way, his crimes helped advance DNA testing. Thanks for nothing, Timothy. 47. Washington. Robert Lee Yates, the RV Reaper. Over in Washington, we meet Robert Lee Yates, a man who lived out of an RV and had a habit of turning it into a mobile crime scene. Active in the 1990s, Yates targeted sex workers in Spokane, often luring them into his RV with promises of safety. Here's the jaw-dropping part. When neighbors complained about the smell coming from his RV, Yates blamed it on bad fish. I mean, who keeps fish in an RV? Spoiler alert, it wasn't fish. Caught after police matched DNA evidence to his crimes, Yates was sentenced to death. His RV? Probably in a junkyard somewhere, giving mechanics the creeps. 48. West Virginia. Harry Powers, the Lonely Hearts Killer. West Virginia's Harry Powers had a unique approach to dating. He joined Lonely Hearts clubs, wooed women through letters, and then robbed and murdered them. In the 1930s, Powers used his charm to lure widows and single women to his murder farm. Here's where it gets ridiculous. Powers claimed he was helping his victims by sparing them from heartbreak. Oh, Harry, you can't break someone's heart if you've already murdered them. His crimes unraveled when a victim's family got suspicious, and police found his gruesome lair. Powers was sentenced to death, proving that sometimes the wrong swipe isn't on Tinder, but on a pen pal letter. 49. Wisconsin. Ed Gein, the DIY enthusiast. Wisconsin gives us Ed Gein, the man who inspired Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. Gein wasn't just a murderer, he was also a DIY enthusiast. After killing 2 women in the 1950s, Gein turned his home into a craft project from hell, making lampshades out of human skin and bowls from skulls. Martha Stewart, eat your heart out. On second thought, maybe don't. Caught after a local hardware store owner went missing, Gein confessed with zero remorse. He spent the rest of his life in a mental institution, where we can only hope no one gave him access to arts and craft supplies. 50. Wyoming. Dale Wayne Eaton, the Great Basin Killer. Finally, we end our journey in Wyoming with Dale Wayne Eaton, the Great Basin Killer. Eaton's crimes in the 1980s included kidnapping, assault, and murder. But what makes his case unforgettable? His obsession with bearing evidence in his backyard, including his victims. The dramatic irony? Eaton was caught because he didn't pay for a speeding ticket, leading police to his property. Imagine being so careless about your parking tickets that it leads investigators to your literal graveyard. Sentenced to death, Eaton now spends his days contemplating his inability to follow basic traffic laws. And Wyoming? Well, it might just be grateful to see the back of him. And there you have it, folks. 50 states, 50 killers, and enough bizarre trivia to make you double-check your locks tonight. From DIY lamp making in Wisconsin to fishy-smelling RVs in Washington, America's dark side is as creative as it is terrifying. But here's the big question. What is it about these ordinary places that produce such extraordinary evil? Is it the quiet neighborhoods, the lonely highways, or just the human condition gone horribly wrong? One thing's for sure. This journey across the U.S. proves that even the strangest stories can be horrifyingly real. Thanks for coming along, and remember, trust your gut, lock your doors, and maybe think twice before accepting free candy from strangers.